Bruce wants to know if it's a sin as a Christian to eat pork.
Heavens no. We were freed from those dietary restrictions. Jesus said he said all foods are clean. He made that statement. He said what comes out of your heart is what defiles you, not what comes into your stomach. And the thing about pork is they have trichinosis and all this other stuff. So the pork's got to be cooked carefully. If it's not, you might get some worm that wouldn't do you any good, but it's not a sin.
What did Jesus teach about eating meat in the New Testament Gospels? Well, if you go to Mark chapter 7, verse 14 through 19, Jesus makes it very clear his position on this. He says here in verse 14, "Then Jesus called to the crowd to come and hear. All of you listen," he said, "and try to understand. It's not what goes into your body that defiles you. You are defiled by what comes from your heart." So now it says here in verse 17, "Then Jesus went into a house to get away from the crowd, and his disciples asked him what he meant by the parable he had just used." They say, "Hey, Jesus, I don't quite understand what you meant by that. Can you break it down?" And Jesus says in verse 18, "Don't you understand either?" he asked. "Can't you see that the food you put into your body cannot defile you? Food doesn't go into your heart, but only passes through the stomach and then goes into the sewer." By saying this, he declared that every kind of food is acceptable in God's eyes. So there you have it. Jesus is saying, hey, it has nothing to do with what goes into your mouth that makes you clean or unclean or saved or unsaved. It has to do with the condition of your heart.
What does the Bible say about eating pork? I've had a few people reach out to me about this, knowing that in the Old Testament, God commanded that his people not eat pork. But we also need to keep this in mind. There were three types of laws in the Old Covenant: moral laws, civil laws, and ceremonial laws. Not all the laws in the Old Testament were related to morality, and things regarding food and cleanliness, those were not typically moral laws. In fact, in the New Covenant, when Jesus dies on the cross for you and for me and for all of mankind, Jews and Gentiles alike, he actually changes that standard. And we learn this when Peter was told by God to kill and eat the very food that he thought he wasn't able to touch. The reason why is because God wanted Peter to be able to reach the people group that didn't follow these same standards. We need to understand that God has ushered us into a new covenant, and this covenant is ruled by love and grace.
I did not say it, Jesus said it. All foods are clean, but what defiles you is the things that are going on in your heart. God also gave Peter a vision, showing him that the formerly unclean foods are now clean. When Jesus died on the cross, he saved all of us. All of us can now be saved through faith, by his grace. And he also fulfilled the Old Testament law. That includes the law about clean and unclean food. 1 Timothy 4 says, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require," listen to this, "and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is made holy by the word of God and prayer." So now you know what Scripture says about eating pork.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for tonight's live stream. I can already see in the comments, in the chat, there's some familiar names, so welcome family, thanks for joining. It's been a while since we've done a live stream, but tonight was a good night to start another one, and especially on this topic, which is a topic that I'm really passionate about because it had a lot to do with the reason why I was brought to this particular perspective and seeing the commandments of God, that they're all valid. And so if this is something that helps even just one or two, it's worth it. And so the person that I'm going to bring on with me tonight is also of the same persuasion. He is very passionate about this subject, and so that's why I wanted to bring him on. And so I hope that this is in some way edifying for those who are not of this particular view, then maybe it would be something that would be helpful for you to see at least where we're coming from. That when we say that all the commandments are still valid, it would help you in that way. But in the same sense, it would also challenge you to take another look at your perspective on these commandments. And so, if you're already of this persuasion, then good. I'm glad. Hopefully, this will give you some sort of tools. Maybe it'll just be a confirmation to what you're already knowing and understanding about this subject. So either way, I appreciate you joining for tonight's broadcast. And so I'm going to bring David on right now. It looks like he's pointing at me for some reason, maybe something to do with my volume. Hey, brother, how's it going? Is my volume really low?
That's what the commentary is saying. So
Okay.
your
Okay.
question has been answered that you had earlier on.
Okay. Let me do something about that. How is that? Is that a lot better? Give me a 1 in the chat if it's good, or give me a 2 if it's still low.
Yeah, you're getting a lot of commentary about that, about the mic's low. So maybe err on the side of caution, go a little bit louder. I don't know how I'm faring as well.
Shout really loud. I don't want to have to shout really loud. Okay, that's better. Let's just turn it up all the way.
Oh, you're getting a 1.
1? Okay, cool.
Yeah, you're getting a 1 from a few people
1?
now.
Okay,
so.
well, I just turned it up a little bit more, so maybe that'll be even better. Okay. Looks like we're good. All right, is me and David's volume level equal? 1 if it's equal.
1. I can't tell myself, but I'm just...
Yeah, I can't tell either.
Okay.
I think you're both
good.
even with
All
each other. Okay, but the video was definitely a bit louder. Okay, yeah. That's the thing about those videos of those people. Their perspectives, not only their volume, but their perspectives seem to speak a little bit louder than the perspective we're going to be talking on tonight. That seems to be the issue. So we're going to try to do something about that. All right, awesome, guys, great. Well, thanks for joining me, David. We haven't done a live stream for over a year now together, so it's good to be able to be back on here with you and talking about this specific subject. For those who don't know, me and David are real good brothers. We talk on a regular basis on the phone and whatnot, and these are the kind of conversations that we have, and we're like, this just needs to be seen and heard by anybody who has ears. And so it's about time we get on here and just start talking on a public platform here. So David, why don't you just start off for those who don't know you and just kind of give us a brief introduction about who you are, what you do, what you've been up to, in case those who do know you are familiar with you. Just let us know what you're up to recently and what you're about.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for having me on, by the way. It's always a pleasure. I end up going on a fair bit of podcasts in a wide array of arenas, if you will. And so I'm oftentimes asked to supply a bio, and I'm always a bit, how do I cater my bio to this particular audience, this topic that we're going to be discussing? Because unfortunately, fortunately, but unfortunately, I've worn a lot of hats in all sorts of arenas over the years. So I guess the relevant points, because oftentimes I'll be asked to go speak at freedom rallies and that type of thing, right? But this has nothing to do with that. And so different bio. What's going to be relevant tonight is, I guess you go back to the testimonies that we supplied, a year and 3 months ago, and people come to understand that I have developed a tremendous love for the Bible over the last number of years. Always kind of, had a love, but it was a bit torn, if you will, or competed with in a sense, through a bit of a skewed lens, because I grew up as a Mormon and was a faithful Mormon for, basically the first 33 years of my life. And I mean faithful in relation to, I was going to church, I was, adhering to the doctrine. I fully ascribed to it theologically, but I was pulled out of that in a beautiful way, and came to understand that no, there's fallacies associated with Mormonism. There's a lot of good, don't get me wrong, but there is those elements that are of falsehoods, if you will, that ultimately lead you away. And so I learned to shed those but also learned to embrace the Bible in its entirety and developed a phenomenal love for it, and have been studying it to a great degree over the last handful of years. And that's, kind of where I'm at. Now, in relation to my, personal life, work life, that will be relevant as well to what we're going to be speaking about today, is that over the past 21 years, I have spent full time working with my father's organization that where we've made leading edge discoveries in relation to treatment of disease and helping people to overcome incurable diseases through proper nutrition, through powerful proprietary nutrition. And this topic that we're going to be discussing this evening is going to really encompass that, because if we're talking about, we're free to eat all of these foods. I don't know what if you'd call them food. They weren't called food biblically, but if we're free to eat anything that we desire, there's going to be consequences, and many times unintended consequences. And that's where a little bit of my expertise over the past 21 years will come into play here, in being able to, especially in relation to brain health, as that's what we've been really focusing in on in relation to mental health conditions, and then also nerve degenerative disorders and whatnot. And so that's applicable. That's absolutely applicable. And I hope everybody who watches this, by the time they're done, they're incredibly convicted from a scientific perspective, but also a biblical perspective, that obviously the Most High knows what he's talking about, and that science is merely validating it today, but it is suppressed science. It's not being shouted from the rooftops, unfortunately, and it's ultimately to protect major industry, and we will discuss that.
Absolutely. All great stuff. So as far as what you are up to, are you going on tour, David, soon? For
Yeah, I apologize. You were trying to pull that out of me as well. Yes, a documentary has recently been produced on myself and my wife, and a situation that we went through, a very corrupt situation, not by any dealings of our own, and where we spent 10 years in the courts, fighting for our lives, really fighting to maintain our family, to stay out of jail, as we continued to fight a false narrative that had been well substantiated through a bunch of medical staff from various parties. And we ended up, getting out from underneath it through a miracle, really, because the court systems, for the most part, the judiciary is absolutely corrupt. And it was a major agenda that was ultimately going to remove parental rights and medical choice in Canada. And they were looking to use my son's death as, basically exploit his death anyways to set this agenda in Canada. And so the documentary has recently come out, and it hasn't been released yet to the public, but it's been done, and we will be going on tour across Canada and into the States as well, doing viewings on it. And so that will be taking place coming up end of May through the first few weeks of June.
That's amazing. Actually, we have the teaser trailer here for anybody who has not seen it. I'm just going to go ahead and show it here real quick for you.
In 2016, I found myself pacing back and forth in this small little jail cell in solitary confinement, wondering, how the heck did I get here? When you start putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, you see a real interesting story that emerges, an unbelievable story, really.
911 emergency, require please fire ambulance.
Hi, yes, my son's not breathing. My son's not breathing.
The RN nurse saw the child a day before 911 is called. She saw no reason to say, take the child to a doctor or go to emergency or anything like this.
She did mention the word meningitis.
He ends up rapidly declining.
They live in a rural place. Well, they say, well, heck, we'll just drive to the hospital.
Not far into the ride, he stopped breathing again.
We're driving down the highway really fast, and we meet up with an ambulance, and we hand Ezekiel over.
They're charged with failing to provide the necessities of life. You didn't see a lot of those prosecutions. Now you do, and Alberta is the worst. You know, Children's Hospital in Calgary.
I get a phone call from the medical examiner's office saying that the autopsy has been performed and the report is complete, and that Ezekiel's death was vaccine preventable.
They treated him with home remedies, including mixtures of maple syrup and horseradish, instead of going to a doctor.
I mean, it was such a high-profile case. I don't even want to talk to people about it because the press has convinced them this child died of bacterial meningitis, and these parents were just so outrageous, you know, trying to treat bacterial meningitis with maple syrup. Like, that wasn't the evidence.
I was going to commit suicide because I felt I was a horrible person from reading what the media had said about me.
The pathologist that did the autopsy, he had received a letter from the Department of Justice, basically suggested Ezekiel died of bacterial meningitis. Now that's highly inappropriate. And why would you do that?
They were trying to create case law that would allow them to criminalize people who didn't give their children vaccines.
An expert's supposed to be impartial. He was there to have them convicted, and I had that feeling about a lot of the doctors. This is tied for the dirtiest trial I've ever had to experience in my life.
The doctor wrote at the bottom in big bold letters, "I am not involved, underline, underline." Not involved in what?
So, I mean, just a heavy story, and I'm glad I'm glad they're shedding light on your story, David. It's a great story. You've told it to me and to countless people, and it needs to be shared because, I mean, too much to say on that. We've got a whole show about it, obviously, with the testimony of David and the last live stream, but it's just a mess they tried to put you in. You're no stranger to being caught into lies and having results in your life being caused by lies. I mean, that's really what this whole live stream is about today, is just many people's lives being affected by lies that they have believed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wouldn't you say?
Oh, 100%. I mean, we've all fallen victim to the traditions of our fathers. But we all have the ability to, receive discernment if we actually ask for it and we seek for it and we seek for his ways to be able to actually come out of the traditions of our fathers that led them astray and also led us astray into strange paths that we didn't even recognize that we were in. So absolutely. And, going through all of this as well, I can say this much, when you're, in the throes of Mormonism, you don't really put a lot of weight on Psalms. It was never really something that was taught a lot in church. Nothing really emphatically taking place there. And so when I started to go through this, I began to really resonate with David, right? And the Psalms, and began to realize the power in them when you begin to experience the significant injustices that will come into your life, especially when you seek to do that which is right. You got to brace up. You got to, buckle up, because you're in for a ride, because you're going to find that all sorts of unjust people will find their ways into your life and attempt to tear you down. And it's a journey worth taking, but it's not for the faint of heart. And it's for those that ultimately are willing to humble themselves before the Most High and allow him to carry us through. Because that's ultimately what the story of the past 10 years of our life was being buoyed up and him carrying us through the deep waters.
This is exactly why Jesus tells us to count the cost, because you're not going to go ahead and just build and then just quit and be called a wise man for it. So following the truth is not easy, and the results are not always easy, but the end result is going to be glory and immortality.
Yep.
And so your story reminds me of Joseph. Definitely. I'm sure you've got that before. So, David, one of the first thing I want to address here is some of these intro videos that we've seen. And one of the narratives that we hear a lot in modern day Christianity is this narrative, and you already mentioned it, but this narrative that we are free to disregard God's commandments. And so that's really the first one we're going to touch on. I mean, what was your first thought when you heard this? No, let me ask a different question. What are your current thoughts about this narrative about Jesus came to free us from the commandments? Now, in general, we'll talk about that later, but specifically the dietary commandments, what are your thoughts on that?
If that were the case, then ultimately he would have been setting us up for no small amount of punishment,
Right.
which is ultimately what we're going to get to. And that's me putting on my health hat. And so it doesn't make any sense. First of all, it's not clear, right? And I'm a very logical, black and white type individual in relation to when I read the scriptures. If it's not there, if I can't connect the dots, if it's not evidentiary, then I'm not going to put weight on it. I'm not going to sit there and impose my perspective onto the scriptures to derive meaning from them. That doesn't work. I count for nothing in the equation, right? They speak for themselves. I need to look at them for what they actually are. I can't find it. Obviously, there was a translation there that was being used. I believe it was the NLT. That was an interesting translation.
That was, I'd actually never heard that before 14. That one.
Or Mark 7, sorry, right?
Yeah, Mark 7. Yeah.
Let's go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I mixed this up here. In a more general sense, we'll get to the specifics rather about the dietary instructions, but there's some really crucial principles about this narrative about being free from the commandments of God in general. I mean, when we see verses like this, are we free from the truth? I mean, where does this verse come into play for my doctrine? Are all the commandments still true? Is this still something that we can grab hold of? What do you think?
Well, yes. Here's the bit of the oxymoron here is, I mean, we are free to do whatever we want, but we're not free to choose the consequences. And when you contrast the very concept here, right, all your commandments are truth. Well, when Yeshua himself says, if you continue in my words, then you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. When we see that the truth and freedom, in many of my walk and talk videos on principles of freedom that I've done over the years, I've also connected the dots between virtue and liberty, right? Which virtue is living in the truth. It's living in accordance with his ways. That's where virtue is derived. And when we do that, we end up with liberty. But liberty cannot exist amongst a people where virtue ceases to exist. And even the founding fathers of the US, a number of them articulated quite well on that very principle, that those are inseparable. Virtue and liberty are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. And so the same thing applies here. If we're going to separate ourselves from the truth, which we are free to do, we have that agency to do so. He gives us the right to choose. Inevitably, when we separate ourselves from the truth, bondage is to be expected. Bondage in various forms. And tonight that we'll be talking about the bondage associated with disease, right? Because that's what this is all about. When we're talking about dietary restrictions, as well as eating that which we're supposed to eat, that's all about empowering our bodies to be a clean temple, a temple that can be used on a spiritual level, and that ultimately is that we're able to serve him and perform our will, or not our will, his will, while we're here, right? And we can't do that when we can't do that very well. And sometimes we can't do it at all when we are under the bondage of disease.
Right. Right. And so the narrative, you can see the results. One of the things that we can lay hold on is that all the commandments are truth. And when you start to see, this very important fundamental principle in the scriptures, you can see all throughout the Tanakh, you can see God saying, hang on to my commandments, hang on to the truth. And then you also have here in Deuteronomy, he says, whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add or take away from it. And right after this, back then you didn't have chapter and verse. You just went right into what we understand as Deuteronomy 13. And you have these false prophets this is how you tell a false prophet, right? Is if it's not if they can perform miracles. It's not if they can dream dreams and tell visions or have visions. It's if they're obeying the voice of the Lord and they're also telling you to do it as well. The opposite of that is a false prophet. And so it's no coincidence that he starts by saying you shall not add or take away from the commandments of God, which is the voice of God. And so this is what he's spelling out to us is a false prophet. And Jesus says that you shall know them by their fruits. And that's exactly what you're saying, David, is that the fruits of this message, that this is a liberating thing to disregard God's commandments, and specifically the dietary instructions, is a liberation. You're letting go of these restrictive instructions from the Old Testament. I mean, you can just see the results from that. And we're going to get into some of the specifics, but that's essentially what you're saying, David, is that you can just see the fruits of this message, and it's tearing people apart. There's destruction, there's chaos coming from this, and people don't even want to acknowledge it.
Oh, it's incredibly deceptive, because in the moment it is liberating, but the fruits, like you're saying, or time will tell, that bondage ensues. But unfortunately, many people aren't self-aware enough or analytical enough to be able to determine cause and effect and why they're in the situations that they're in currently. And if they can't do that, then they'll continue in this vicious cycle of repeating what they've already done that ultimately brought them into bondage in the first place. But ultimately, or oftentimes, it's a form of self-deception, and it's actually engaging in willful blindness, where they could recognize it, but they don't want to recognize it because they don't want to give up certain elements of their lifestyle. And so they'll blind themselves to the effect that it's having, or the negative effect it's having in their life.
Yeah, I mean,
and then it becomes self-perpetuating.
Absolutely. I know that there's plenty of people out there who would prefer that, bacon and shrimp and alligator meat or whatever is something that's approved of by God, that he gives a stamp of approval that this is what I created to be for food, but it's not. And so we have to look at where we find objective truth from, and not just our base whatever truth is on our feelings. We need to see what the Word of God says. And so, like this message of liberation from God's commandments, it's interesting that this is one of the things that they always surround that narrative with, is the dietary instructions, the Sabbath, as if these are just restrictive from the things that we want to do, right? It's just an interesting concept. But when we look at false prophets, are we willing to admit that Jesus is no exception when it comes to how we are to test whether someone is a false prophet or not? Is he an exception? I mean, is it whatever he says is truth and we just grab onto it? No, if what he said did not go along with what Yahweh said. No. Yes, if he went along with what Yahweh said. Because this is, people want to say that, well, the Jews, it was ingrained in them from their youth to, it was hard for them to let go of these things, the dietary instructions, the Sabbath. And so that's why you have this conflict in Romans 14, that, it's really a matter of personal preference. And the Jews, they just couldn't let go. It was so ingrained in their flesh. But if you read the scriptures in Deuteronomy, they're to walk in the commandments. They're to think about the commandments. They're to teach them to their children. They're to teach them to their grandchildren. They're to have them about their forehead at all times, always thinking about them, always acting upon them. They're to have the tassels on their the edge of their garment to remind them of the commandments. This is something that was supposed to be ingrained in them. So yeah, you want to know who ingrained this into a people? It was God himself. And so, sorry if they're not just so willing to accept this message that the Messiah, their supposed Messiah, freed them from the things that God commanded them to hold on to. And so, Jesus, if he truly said the things that modern day Christianity claims that he said and did, this is his work, that he freed us from the commandments. It just doesn't make sense, for one. If he says he's really from Yahweh, if he's really from God, because you can see things like this, right? Ezekiel 22, the conspiracy of her prophets in her midst is like a roaring lion tearing the prey. They have devoured people. He says that this people, whatever we're about to read, these people are devouring people. They're roaring lions. And David, does that language sound familiar to you at all? Roaring lion. Can you think of anybody else in the scripture that is described as someone who prowls around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour? Does that language sound familiar?
You made that very clear by putting that context together. Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. For anybody who's not aware, Hasatan, Satan, this is what Peter said that he does. He roams around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And so continuing on, he says, they have taken treasure and precious things. They have made many widows in her midst. Her priests have violated my law and profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between the holy and the unholy, nor have they made known the difference between the what? The unclean and the clean. And they have hidden their eyes from my Sabbaths, so that I am profaned among them. And so what's interesting is that he's describing this roaring lion, this wolf, this animal who's devouring his people. And what does he say about this particular group of people that is doing this? They're violating his law, and they're no longer making a distinction between what is clean and what is unclean. And they're hiding his eyes away. They're hiding their eyes away from his Sabbath, as if they're just void. And so when you start to think about this narrative that modern Christianity propels, that Jesus freed us, and we don't have to make a distinction between our ham and our hamburger anymore. This is exactly what God, through the prophet Ezekiel, is conveying to us, is that this is one of the qualities of a lion, of a devourous animal. So how am I to believe that my Savior, who actually brings freedom, who said that you shall know the truth and the truth will make you free, how am I supposed to believe that he's the one who brought this absolute devourous narrative into the church? I mean, is that something that's fair to even question, David?
Well, I want to cover this just from a kind of an investigative type standpoint here. What you would expect to find within the scriptures, within the New Testament, as we see oftentimes, we see the accusations that are being laid against the apostles. We see the accusations that are being laid against Yeshua himself by the Pharisees, by the Sadducees, by the high ups in the the religious sects. We see that. What we don't see is, if he brought this narrative about and declared all foods as clean, meaning everything that could be possibly consumed as clean, you would see that come up as a revilement of the law at some point in time against Yeshua, and if not against Yeshua, against his apostles, if they were observing that, if that was actually the case. We don't find it. You can't find a single argument being laid anywhere, any accusations anywhere. I mean, when we see Luke 23, we see that they bring him to Pilate, and immediately they lay accusations before Pilate about what Yeshua was about. And obviously it was the relevant accusations that Pilate would take note of, and that was in relation to, creating an uproar and teaching people not to pay taxes, right? So they're not going to go into the other elements that are specific to the law or the Torah that Pilate wouldn't see as relevant. But the fact of the matter is, we don't ever see that accusation being laid against those that were part of the way or the Netzara. We don't see it. You just don't see it. And so, and there's other circumstantial evidence that supports that it clearly wasn't the case. So, if I was a betting man, I would be willing to bet everything on the fact that he didn't come about, especially in relation to the dietary restrictions, to undo the workings of his father.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think it's specifically because Yeshua understood what true freedom was, and I think he was in agreement with David when he said that, so shall I keep your law continually forever and ever, and I will walk at liberty, for I seek your precepts. I mean, I don't know if anybody's seen it, but there's a short that I did on I did a full response video to Michael Pearl, but he said that nowhere in the scriptures is the law anywhere near the word liberty. They're never used in the same sentence. There's no correlation. And I mean, what is this doing here then, if that's the case? So it's just amazing that you would, if you didn't read the Bible for yourself, you would have just taken that man for his word and said the same thing that many pastors behind the pulpit are trying to make their congregation believe, that liberty truly comes when you don't walk in the law. The law is bondage. And so it's just really amazing that you have that. And I think you mentioned it before. One of the reasons why that is because the pastors are fleshly pastors, and we see in 2 Peter 2:18, he says, "For when they speak great swelling words of emptiness, they allure through the lusts of the flesh, through lewdness, the ones who have actually escaped from those who live in error. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by whom a person is overcome, by him also he is brought into bondage." And so Peter is talking about false prophets. That's what this whole chapter is about here, where Peter is talking about false prophets. He says, beware of these men. And, they speak great swelling words. And you see really a lot of pastors today, they got a big platform, they got a big stage with a big congregation, big audience. And I mean, these speakers are just great. The way that they articulate, the way that they can bring about, all these different analogies and with how they want to get a message across. It's just really great speakers, really close to just how a speaker could just seem so entertaining, swinging from chandeliers. These are the kind of preachers that you want to listen to. But while they speak these great swelling words, they're conveying a message to their audience that is alluring through the lust of their flesh, and they don't even know it. And what we mean is that when they say this, oh no, you don't have to make a distinction between, ham and hamburger. You can eat whatever you want. Jesus freed us from that. That is not speaking to the spirit man that Paul refers to when he says that the law is spiritual, but I'm carnal, and my fleshly desires sometimes get in the way of the inner man wanting to walk after the law, which is spiritual. That's the spiritual man. And so that message that they're getting across, that they're trying to convey to these people, are not addressing the inner man that they're supposed to be walking in if they're followers of Christ. It's addressing their flesh. And that's why it's so easy to grab onto. And even though this message is wrapped up and explained and sold as liberty and liberating, it's actually bringing them into bondage, which is exactly what you're saying.
Virtue and liberty are inseparable. And so really it comes down to defining, how do we obtain virtue in our lives? And if that is by adhering to his words, following his instructions, which I would argue till I'm blue in the face that yes, it is, that outside of that, we are without virtue. When virtue does not exist, liberty will cease to exist as well. It only takes a short period of time. They are absolutely connected on a pretty tight leash. And so for anybody to proclaim liberty from the law, and that you're going to be freed from, by doing so, they don't understand the fundamental principles of liberty. They should actually take a step back from the Bible for a bit and just go and study liberty, go and study freedom, go and study some of the works of the founding fathers and any other free nation, or a nation that was free for a time before it gave itself over to debauchery, which ultimately led to bondage, which ultimately led to destruction. That is the cycle that we see within history of once great nations. It is the common factor. It's what we see in the Bible with Israel. When they turn from the way, they give themselves over to debauchery, they give themselves over to all sorts of sin. Every single time it resulted in bondage. But that's not just a biblical principle that you find it just replete throughout history. Anytime that a nation gives itself over to debauchery, to living outside of the bounds or the laws or instructions that the Most High gave, they will cease to be free in very short order.
That's a big lesson. I think that a lot of people, especially in the younger generations or my generation, need to really just internalize that concept of you don't have freedom without law. You have no freedom. You know, if they just all of a sudden tomorrow they said, you know, we're going to make it everybody's freedom to take somebody else's life for whatever reason. And they can steal, we'll go by Darwin's law, you know, the strongest are going to win. How freeing is that for you and your family? You know, are you free to let your children play out in the yard without having to work? I mean, there's concerns that come naturally with living in a cursed world about just letting your kids go off and play without restrictions as it is. You know, kids, hey, don't go playing on the road. I mean, that doesn't sound like bondage to me. That sounds like I care about my kids. And so people need to really, I don't think they connect that. And it's just weird to me that they would see a restriction as a lack of a love, you know. It's just interesting to me. But, you know, one of the things that's one of the narratives, but another thing that a couple of these guys that I had in the intro talked about was that the Acts 10 vision. And so that's one of the things that I want to talk about here is I want to address that, because there's so many people who don't understand what's going on in this chapter. And just so we're clear here, let me bring this up. Just so we're clear here. When we talk about dietary instructions, we're not talking about just you shall not eat pig, right? That's probably the number one instruction when it comes to dietary instructions that people latch onto when they think about that. But I mean, you don't really see a whole lot of people going against the instruction not to eat, you know, an iguana. You know, well, actually people do eat iguanas, but I'm sure there is a culture that would go against that. But that's another thing, is like, when we talk about what you can eat and what you can't eat, how many Americans do you think would say it was wrong for someone to eat a dog or a cat? How many Americans do you think would stand up against those who eat dog and cats right in front of them? I'm sure they wouldn't say, it's their freedom to do that. Maybe it is, because in their country they have that freedom, but I guarantee that's not how they're actually feeling. But it's subjective. I mean, it's really up to them if they want to eat that or not. If they truly believe this narrative, that it's a matter of personal preference, then they should if they even feel that way of judgment towards them, they got some work to do, right? If that narrative is true. But this dietary restrictions, we're talking about a design issue. You know, he says, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, speak to the children of Israel, saying, these are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. So these are the ones you can eat. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, and chewing the cud, that you may eat. And so people think that this is just, you know, people usually skim over that, but the purpose of the dietary instructions are, for one, to keep us from, you know, what we're going to be getting into, the parasites and the bad results, just an unhealthy thing to eat. But it's also to see, oh my goodness, this God, Yahweh, who instructed these specific instructions, is proving himself to be the designer and the creator, because I see the science backs up that these animals that he's describing that are good are actually good, and the ones he describes as not good are actually doing a real number on people. But he's also showing you how to identify by his design, cloven hooves, chewing the cud. He's talking about how he made these things. And so it's just interesting that people don't want to, you know, they think it's just, oh, these laws were given to a specific people to make them different, you know, to make them a little bit weirder so they can stand out, so that, you know, they would get people's attention. No, they were a people who were given revelation about their creator's design, and they were to be a light to the nations. And so that's really what we're doing when we observe and we make a distinction between the clean and the unclean, as he's instructing here. And so he mentions a number of things.
You know,
Sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, to apply that whole ideology that, oh, it's to help them be set apart, right? To differentiate them. This would be a very ineffective way of differentiating a people. Changing the outward appearance would be the easiest way to differentiate a people. The only time that you would understand that they're differentiated through dietary laws is when you sit down to eat with them, which wasn't something that was happening in, you know, at a whole lot, right? Especially, you know, as we moved, you know, the time continuum goes on to the time that we get to Yeshua. They didn't want to be seen with Gentiles. They considered them to be dogs, and they weren't eating with them. So it would be a very ineffective way. And I'm not saying that by them considering Gentiles as dogs was even good, because they'd already been given the instructions back in the Torah on those that were aliens or that were outside of the lineage of Israel, how they could enter into the covenant as well. So that was already given there. But the fact of the matter is that this would be a very ineffective, illogical way if the motive was merely to set them apart, to make them different by giving them dietary restrictions, because it's not readily seen, such as other things like the beard and the corners of your hair and all that type of stuff, not changing any of that up. That's different. That will help them to be set apart from other nations that don't do those things, because it's on the outward appearance.
Yeah, for a Jewish man, an Israelite back in those times, before you had, the oral Torah and the Talmud, the Mishnah, those kind of oral teachings in circulation, the sages and the rabbis, they were imposing on the people. Before that, eating with anybody of the nations, it would have been very enlightening for those of the nations to see, wait, why aren't you eating that? Well, because we're commanded not to, and go through that explanation. Oh, who's your God? Oh, well, he tells us to identify. It would have been a very good way of evangelism. And, so it would have been a great way to, so my point in saying that is that you have people today that say, well, you can't really have fellowship with these people if you maintain these dietary instructions, and that's why God had us get rid of those, is because you couldn't fellowship with these people. As you heard from the intro, that guy saying Jesus changed the standard so that he could reach those people. What do you mean? Why couldn't he reach those people? And then that's to say, like, well, didn't he have a ministry to his brethren as well? So he, what about with them? What if they would have heard that he's eating pork chops with the Gentiles across the street? Do you think he would have had a right to speak in their lives now? They would have had no part of it. So, I mean, it just crumbles apart when you talk about that as something that actually was a purpose in God's mind. And so one of the things that he talks about is in Acts 10, Peter's vision. And this is where one of the people that we just saw in the intro, they said that we get this, that Jesus changed the standard from Acts 10. We get this from Acts 10. It's interesting that he skipped over Mark 7, as if that wasn't one of the times. So I'm going to assume that this is where he says that this is flat out where Jesus changes that standard. A lot of questions come up immediately if this is where he all of a sudden changes that standard, because you already have his whole ministry in Matthew 5, where he's saying, I didn't come to destroy the law or the prophets. I came not to destroy, but to fulfill. And he says that, whoever teaches the least of these will be called, or whoever does and teaches these will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever does not do them and teaches others not to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. I'm pretty sure that he's the name above all names right now as we speak, right? So how could he be teaching people not to observe, even if these were the least of the commandments? How could he still have an exalted name above above everybody? I mean, you would assume by his own words that someone who would teach the dietary instructions would even have a greater name than Jesus. I don't know, just some thoughts that come to mind.
Well said.
So let's go through here. Acts 10, one of the most misused, misapplied chapters in the entire Bible by far. And so we're just going to go through these and just read them, pick out some parts, and we'll get the conclusion as we read this. So he says, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment, a devout man and one who feared God with all his household, who gave alms generously to the people and prayed to God always. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God coming and saying to him, Cornelius. And when he observed him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? So he said to him, Your prayers and your alms have come up for a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa and send for Simon, whose surname is Peter. He is lodging with Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea. He will tell you what you must do. And when the angel who spoke to him had departed, Cornelius called 2 of his household servants and a devout soldier from among those who waited on him continually. So when he had explained all these things to them, he sent them to Joppa. Now, what's interesting, David, just right off the bat, you have this angel, this agent of God, coming to Peter. And wouldn't you think it would be way easier if the angel just told him whatever was about to be said by Peter?
So what do you mean by that?
I'm sorry. So the angel is telling him to go to Peter to hear something.
Yep.
Why didn't he just tell him? And I mean, I may be getting ahead of myself here, so let me just continue on.
Well, there's a lesson for many to learn from this.
Right, exactly.
It's going to be a pinnacle moment in relation to restoring. This is my ideology on it. Restoring what was already established from the very beginning when Moses and all the Israelites left Egypt. There was instructions, very clear and concise instructions on those that are not of you, how they can become a part of the covenant, but yet somehow that's lost in translation over the next 1400 years to the point that we get to where we're at today. And they're calling any of the pagan nations, any of the Gentiles, dogs, and that they're not to break bread with them, they're not to commune with them, and they're definitely not there to convert them, which was a deviation from what we saw given to Moses.
Yeah, culturally, it was even if someone from the nations wanted to come and say, I want Yahweh as my God, I want to serve him, I want to take upon himself my ways, I'm a God-fearer, like Cornelius was. He was a God-fearer. He was doing the commandments, right? Mm-hmm. They would still be considered second-class citizens,
right?
Even if they did everything that they were that the Jews were doing, just because they weren't native born. And so this kind of perspective was the traditional view, and it apparently was the same mindset Peter had, and you can't blame him. I mean, this is a people that grew up getting the dogma from the rabbis, and the Pharisees. So he needed to be converted in this way too.
And for generations they lived under oppression from these other nations, so it would be most natural for them to develop a resentment towards them. I'm not saying it's right, but it would be most natural for them to just do that. And so, looking at the environment, the political environment, everything that they were shrouded in, Peter needed to learn a lesson. He needed to be liberated from those dogmas that he was holding on to.
Absolutely. And so I think that's the reason. That's what I was getting to about the angel. Why didn't he just give the message to Cornelius that Peter was going to say? And it's interesting that he's trying to bring the Jew and the Gentile together. That's really the goal here. That's why he didn't just give him the message. He sent him to Peter. So David, do you want to read just this a little bit until we stop?
Yeah, for sure.
And just kind of assess what we just read.
Yep. The next day, as they went on their journey and drew near the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. Then he became very hungry and wanted to eat, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance and saw heaven opened, an object like a great sheet bound at the 4 corners, descending to him and let down to the earth. In it were all kinds of 4-footed animals of the earth, wild beasts, creeping things, and birds of the air. And a voice came to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean." And a voice spoke to him again the second time, "What God has cleansed, you must not call common." This was done 3 times, and the object was taken up into heaven again.
Okay, so pretty simple. He sees the vision of all these animals, and the voice is telling him to kill and eat these things. And of course, he's protesting. He knows the Torah. He knows the law. These are abominable things that he's being told to eat. And so, there's a lot of people that say, well, why would Peter be told by God to eat these things if he didn't really want him to eat the things that he's telling him to eat? I mean, I don't know about you, David, but I can think of a couple things, metaphoric ways that God was trying to get a message across to people in the scriptures that he didn't really want them to go and do, but just was kind of testing them, or maybe he was trying to bring about another message to them. I think of Joseph with the sun and the moon and the stars bowing to him. I mean, did that really happen? Do you remember that in the scriptures where the sun and the moon actually bowed down to Joseph?
No, they didn't happen, but the metaphoric imagery definitely sent a very strong message.
Absolutely.
And then obviously previous to that, the sheep's bowing down as well. Yeah, so I don't want to railroad this right now, but there's something else that is just glaring in relation to what we just read.
Right.
I don't know if you want me to go there. I think you know where I'm going with this.
Go ahead.
So Peter says, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean." How many years after Mark 7 took place is this protest happening where he's saying, whoa, 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 that's not right? But Peter was present with Yeshua at Mark 7. He would have heard the message. And if the message was resoundingly clear, all foods are declared clean. Why is Peter having any hesitancy with this at this point in time?
Yeah, if Yeshua was actually declaring all foods clean in Mark 7 as it's usually preached, how come he's still doing this? How come he's still refusing? It makes no sense. And so if this is the starting point where you believe that no, the dietary instructions are not something that's obligated for a believer in Christ to follow today, if this is where you start, then we're going to break it down. But if it's where you start in Mark 7, if you think that's where he just all of a sudden gets rid of the dietary instructions, then it doesn't make sense that Peter still is not getting the message.
Yeah.
So
it makes no sense at all. One, you would have had accusations against the apostles and against Yeshua for breaching those laws. And two, you wouldn't have had Peter protesting because, of course I'll eat that. Yeshua already declared that, 5 years before as clean. So yeah, I'm fair game. This is great. Like, what a buffet. No.
Exactly. But we see in the last part, okay, where did we see the okay, did it say that he did it 3 times? Okay, yes, right here. So this was done 3 times. And that's really significant as we continue to read why he did it 3 times. Right? Wouldn't you say?
Well, I'd say, yeah, absolutely. To get the point across, you'll find that oftentimes just in Hebrew writings where things are repeated 3 times just to make sure that the point is not lost.
Right. So he says, "Arise, Peter, kill and eat. Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And he did this 3 times. And so we're going to keep reading and see why this is happening. So now, while Peter wondered within himself what this vision which he had seen meant, that's weird that he's not just taking it for, oh, now I can just go ahead and go eat pork chops. He's still wondering within himself what exactly this vision meant. And so while he's wondering within himself, behold, the men who had been sent from Cornelius had made inquiry for Simon's house and stood before the gate. And they called and asked whether Simon, whose surname was Peter, was lodging there. While Peter thought about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Behold, 3 men are seeking you. Arise, therefore, go down and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them." Why would he be doubting? It's because of the things that we just said. Because in this culture, you wouldn't be just sitting down having a meal with a Gentile. They're second class. They're not a native born. And so he says, "Arise. 3 men are seeking you." And this is all while he was wondering what the vision meant. And so the Spirit told him these things. And so then Peter went down to the men who had been sent to him from Cornelius and said, "Yes, I am he whom you seek. For what reason have you come?" And they said, "Cornelius the centurion, a just man, one who fears God." Go read Ecclesiastes 12 if you want to know what someone who fears God is described as, and has a good reputation among all the nation of the Jews, was divinely instructed by a holy angel to summon you to his house and to hear words from you. Then he invited them in and lodged them. On the next day, Peter went away with them, and some brethren from Joppa accompanied him. And the following day, they entered Caesarea. Now Cornelius was waiting for them, and had called together his relatives and close friends. As Peter was coming in, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshipped him. But Peter lifted him up, saying, "Stand up, I myself am also a man." And as he talked with him, he went in and found many who had come together. Then he said to them, and here's the key part, "You know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with or to go to one of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any pork or mouse common or unclean." That's not exactly what it says, is it? He says that I should not call any man common or unclean. So there you go. He interprets the vision. He gets the point. The message is, don't call anybody that I have approved of and accepted unclean, because those of the nations who want to come and join themselves to the Lord and walk in my ways, I have accepted them. They are clean, even though they don't get everything. Maybe they're not circumcised at this point. They're still getting it. I have accepted them. So now they want to continue to learn. And guess what? You who claim to be a light to the nations, make sure you're doing them too, and make sure you're teaching them, right? And so this is the point. And then not only that, he goes on to tell those of his brethren what they had told him, or what the angel had told him. And he says, then salvation has come to the Gentiles, right? Where's that verse?
30, is it? No, it's not 34 that you were thinking.
Yeah, he's going and telling the testimony again. Okay, you get it though. So the purpose of this vision is to show Peter and anybody else who thinks that Gentiles are second-class citizens, even though they want to walk in the ways of Yahweh, they're not. They're accepted as brethren, and this wall of partition between Jew and Gentile is now broken down in Messiah Yeshua, because he is saying, nope, they're of one new man. So don't treat them any different. Doesn't matter where you're born. You're my people. And so that's the reason this message was given. That's the purpose for this vision. And so the fact that this is the gospel message in its entirety. This is beautiful. No way did the Jews, when they were expecting a Messiah, did they sit there and say, oh, well, yep, he's going to be spreading a message outside our borders too. That wasn't even a thought in their mind, even though it should have been, because you have verses like this. Then I will sow her for myself in the earth, and I will have mercy on her who had not obtained mercy. Then I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people, and they shall say, you are my God. And so this idea that this message of salvation would come to those who were just heathen, who didn't know of his ways, this was supposed to be expected. This was prophesied, right? And already this was being practiced. You see Ruth, you see other people who were of the nations joining themselves to the Lord. You see in Isaiah 56 where he says that those who join themselves to the Lord and fear me and choose to walk and do what pleases me and walk in my Sabbaths, even them I will give them a name better than that of sons and daughters, and their sacrifices and offerings will be accepted upon my altar. And so he's telling the Gentiles, like, don't think that you are not the Lord's people. You are my people. If you want to do what I tell you to do and you want to be a part of my people, you're no different, no matter where you're born. And so this is the message that Peter is trying to receive, that he didn't know before because of the cultural things that he had been ingrained in from very early on.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And we see that principle being applied right off the bat when Yeshua goes to Samaria first, right? And that here these were, Torah observant people. That's all they had was the Torah. They didn't have, the prophets. They just had the Torah. But they weren't of Israel descent. The Israelites had been supplanted into it, taken into Assyria, and then Assyria went and took multiple nations and threw them into Samaria, back in about 700 BC, and they remained as such. But what happened was according to the Bible, there's an interesting story there that, some lions started to come in, and they had a plague of lions, and it was told them that they were, that they weren't being blessed by the gods because they didn't know the God of this land. And so then Assyria sent some of the priests back, and that's when the people that came into Samaria, which were not Israelites, were then taught the Torah and adopted it. And so here you have, now you fast forward 700 years, and you have Yeshua visiting them and having no difference between them and the Jews in Judea. So kind of an interesting thing there, right? The principle was already in play, but it was just so culturally ingrained for so long at that point in time that Peter needed to learn that lesson in a very dramatic way. And unclean foods would have been just the right level of drama for him to get the message.
Exactly. Hey, Nephilim Slayer. Boom, baby. I appreciate that. I really do. Thank you. So, yeah, it's just very interesting that the enemy would take a beautiful message like that and just pervert it to actually dismiss the Father's ways. It's absolutely amazing. And then one of the next things that we've seen, we'll back up just for a second, okay? One of the things that we've seen, and we've already addressed it somewhat, we've already touched on it, is this idea that in Mark 7, Yeshua declares all foods clean. And it's interesting, we talked about this before, David, is that you don't hardly see anybody bringing up Matthew 15, the second witness to this encounter that Yeshua had with the Pharisees, and his apostles were there, his disciples. You don't really see anybody using Matthew 15 to support this claim. And so we're going to look at Matthew 15, the second witness, and see what exactly was going on in this situation where people claim that he declared all foods clean. And so, I mean, when I just say that, David, what are your first thoughts when I say Jesus declared all foods clean? What's the first thing that
What's
comes
my
to your mind?
first thought?
Yeah.
Well, if I'm looking at it, if I'm taking it as, I would start to assume, wait a minute, like he just said that pork and, shellfish and all this other stuff is now clean based on that simplistic statement, right? That's the way that I would naturally kind of want to take it, even though it seems awry. That's just kind of what would seem to come about from that within my mind.
Or even just that it's food. I mean, define food for me scripturally. Well, I mean, this was never even a thought in their minds that pork and lobster and shrimp and lizards and, all these cockroaches are food. And so it's just interesting when you hear somebody say, yeah, Jesus declared all foods clean. Okay, but what was the biblical definition of food as he was speaking? It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And so here's where we go to. Oh, I didn't bring it up. Here's where we go to this section of the scripture where Jesus apparently declared all foods clean. And it's interesting because what essentially we're saying is that Jesus let go of the commandments of God. But that's not really what we're seeing happening in this encounter he had with the Pharisees. He says, then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus saying, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. So the charge is, why are your disciples not washing their hands before they eat bread? It's tradition. Why aren't they doing that? That's the charge. And so the charge is not, why are your disciples not eating pork? That would have been a little bit of a different scenario here. Mm-hmm. And so Yeshua says, he answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, honor your father and your mother, pointing to the commandments, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. And so he's reminding them of the voice of God. He says, why do you not listen to the voice of God, as you see in Deuteronomy 13? Because of your traditions. You disregard the voice of God. And he's talking about the commandments. And he says, so for God commanded, but you say something different. Whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his mother or father. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. He's just going off on these Pharisees because they did not care about the commandment of God. And so to say that Jesus is just going to all of a sudden at the end of this just drop the commandments of God and say, no more, it's a little contradictory. Don't you think, David?
More than a little contradictory, for sure.
It is just mind-blowing. And so we continue in verse 10. When he had called the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear and understand. Not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a man. Then his disciples came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? But he answered and said, every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch. Then Peter answered and said to him, explain this parable. So Jesus said, are you also still without understanding? Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated? But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. So Jesus is literally explaining to the disciples, he's like, you didn't get what was going on there? They were trying to say that you're unclean because you're not washing your hands before you eat. Kind of gross, but that doesn't make you unclean and rejected before God, which is the weight that they put on this tradition. They said that whoever negates the washing of hands shall be uprooted from the earth. This is in the Talmud. And they said that whoever disobeys the washing of the hands, it's as though they had sinned with a harlot. This was the weight that they put on this tradition, was that you won't even inherit the coming kingdom. You'll be uprooted from the earth. The wicked are uprooted from the earth. They thought as those who disregarded this as wicked. And so he's saying it's not even if there was, germs or whatever, they thought, I believe, I can't remember where it was, but the Pharisees believed that if Gentiles or anybody else touched these pots and this pottery and they didn't wash their hands, they would actually be transferring demons, unclean spirits, through these pots and pans or their hands. And so that's why this ritual of washing your hands would be so important. And so Jesus is saying, listen, this is not how you are defiled before God, but breaking the commandments of God is what defiles a man. So he's like, why are you letting go of the commandments of God, which actually does make you defiled before God, but you're putting so much weight on something that doesn't even make you defiled before God? And so that was the problem. He's like, you guys are hypocrites. Why do you care so much about that? Oh, because you have worshiped God in vain. You don't actually care about what he cares about.
There's another element to this as well that I think needs to be addressed as well. I mean, you're providing a beautiful second witness to this, but I don't know about in your Bible, but in mine, it's in parentheses where it says, thus he declared all foods clean. Now, whenever it's in parentheses, it's to make note to the reader that there's something with that. Now, what's interesting, so I was just doing a bit of digging. I was looking at my Aramaic translation. It's not found in there. So Mark 7 doesn't have, and thus he declared all foods clean. It's not there. It just isn't. And so I was looking into the footnotes of it as to what's up. And It's not found in the Aramaic transcripts, and it also wasn't found in the early Greek transcripts either, which is a bit of a theme because we do see that a number of times throughout the New Testament is that there was later additions made that were there to support particular theologies, but that they are not found in the original or the oldest Greek manuscripts, that their authenticity can only be dated back a couple hundred years, generally about 300 years after the authors had authored those particular books. So there's something to note there as well, to throw a challenge in there that we shouldn't be putting a whole lot of weight on that particular statement anyways and trying to find out what he was saying, because there's a good chance he didn't say it, especially given the fact that it's not in the what I'll call, or what are deemed oftentimes to be the original Aramaic transcripts, or more original than the Greek before even being translated over into the Greek language, because we know that, especially for Matthew, the history dictates that it was written in Hebrew or in Hebrew letters in the Aramaic.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's something that people don't even, I kind of look over that most times and don't even really touch on it because it's just so blatantly obvious that that's not even part of the scripture. And
yeah, so I apologize if I seemed distracted for a few moments there, but I was just quickly digging into that because, to be honest with you, I've never seen that statement. And so when I pulled open my scriptures here and actually saw that in parentheses, I'd never seen that before, but this is a new translation to me. So that's when I went and did the cross-reference with the Aramaic and saw a little bit of that light being shed, that it's in parentheses for a reason. It's not found in the older manuscripts.
Exactly. Brother John, blessings to you, brother. Thank you so much for that. You're an encouragement. And thank you for your continued support. Yeah, I mean, that's just something that's so missed. I don't even think most people know that or read the front of their Bibles when they kind of give that away. They say, hey, anytime you see anything in parentheses, it's not actually in the manuscript. I think that's missed by most people.
Well, it's not necessarily saying that, but it's bringing attention to the reader, saying there's something to this, look into it. There's something that's perhaps questionable, something that's noteworthy. Every time I've seen something in parenthesis, though, it has been that when I go and look it up, especially in the Aramaic, that it's not in the Aramaic translation. It's just not there. And there's general footnotes that will cross-reference with the newer translations, and it states, it'll talk about what manuscripts it is found in versus what manuscripts it's not found in. And so it really sheds a negative light generally on those things that are found in parenthesis, is that they need to be questioned at minimum, and not a whole lot of weight oftentimes to be placed on them, but that before digging deeper into what's up with them, right?
Exactly. One next thing we'll go through, and it was one of the other verses that was brought up in the intro videos, was 1 Timothy 4. Now it was actually the first video that I ever posted on my channel was around this verse, or around this chapter. So if you want to see that, you can go check it out. I think it was pretty thorough, but we'll go through it here anyways. And so one of the things that one of the gentlemen mentioned was that, this is what's going to happen in the latter times. People are going to start saying you can't eat this or this or this. These are doctrines of demons. And so in the right context, we'll get a different message. But isn't that interesting that it would actually be a doctrine of demons, a teaching of demons, to say that you shouldn't eat pork instead of a commandment of God? How did all of a sudden a commandment of God turn into a demon teaching? I mean, that's a pretty scary position to have, if you ask me. But people say it.
I think we all saw the short video of Greg Locke about a year and a half or two back, decrying the doctrine of Sabbath and emphatically stating that it's a doctrine of demons. So same thing applies. How is it possible that one of the 10 commandments somehow becomes in latter days a doctrine of demons, right? It's an incredibly crafted distortion of the word of the Most High. shockingly, really, for someone to ever come to that conclusion in their mind.
That's a scary thing to say, man. That is very scary. To demonize God's voice.
It's blasphemy.
Yeah, it's very much blasphemous. And so let's read this chapter and see what exactly Paul is conveying to us, because this is one of the people that mainstream Christianity is convinced that abandoned the law, if not Jesus, because he was in a certain dispensation. I agree that Acts 10, Mark 7, Jesus wasn't teaching these things because he was under the law. He had to, which does make more sense. Obviously, I'm of that persuasion that he couldn't have said these things because he was our perfect high priest. Otherwise, he couldn't be resurrected. He had to have atonement himself by high priest. But he was resurrected because he was perfect. And so you can't just go claiming perfection when you're dismissing commandments of God. The law of God, sin is lawlessness, right? So that if you're dismissing laws, you're sinning. And so, but Paul here, this is where the dispensation comes in, where, now it's Paul's gospel. It's no longer the gospel of the kingdom. And I'm telling you, hyper dispensationalists, they say this. They say that Jesus preached the gospel, Paul preached the gospel, and in Revelation there's another gospel where the angel comes down and says, "Fear God, give glory to him." All three of those are three different gospels for three different dispensations. And so it's wild. It's wild. But if you actually just look at these verses in context, they all have the same message. And I tend to like that. I tend to like more simple understandings, right? When I'm looking at the scriptures, I want a simple message. And there seems to be harmony between all these apparently three different messages. There seems to be one message to me when I look at these verses in context. And so this is what 1 Timothy chapter 4, the Apostle Paul says. He says, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For every creature of God is good, and nothing is to be refused, if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by the word of God and prayer." Now, before we get into this, I want to point out something. It says nothing is to be refused if it is received with thanksgiving. Now, if Paul is saying that, anybody who says that you should abstain from any sort of animal, even if it's said it's as unclean in the Torah, they're teaching doctrines of demons. Nothing is to be refused. If you take that for what he actually says here, and then put it in the context of Acts 10, where he says, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." This is not, if you want to take that approach where the foods are no longer a distinction, then you have to actually take what is being said here, because not only does he say that you're not to refuse these things, Peter's also commanded in Acts 10 to eat. It wasn't a matter of opinion. He was commanded to eat it. And so it's not something where you can say, well, you don't have to eat it if you want. No, he says, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." He was commanded. If it really was, he was supposed to take, the conclusion here is you're supposed to not make a distinction anymore. You're to eat it. Then you're commanded to eat, and you're commanded not to refuse. And so it's not, you can't have this view of, well, it's a matter of personal preference then, if you actually take these verses for what they're saying, if that's the message, right? I think there's a little bit more of a logical message to extract from this than that. But if you're going to go that route, you might as well go all the way, is all I'm saying. I don't think you're taking it to its actual conclusion when you say it's saying that. But he says that, he says a lot of things here. But he says that this is key. He says commanding to abstain from foods. Again, what is food biblically? These are the animals that you can eat. These are the animals you're not to eat. Why? Because they weren't made for food. And so commanding to abstain from foods which God created. Remember we were talking about that design in Leviticus 11? To be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the what? The truth. Remember when we just brought up that verse? Very foundational things. All your commandments are truth. The entirety of your word is truth. That includes Leviticus 11. And so Paul is betting on the fact that you understand what truth is when you're reading this. And so he's saying people will come and they'll command that you abstain from foods that are actually permissible by God, right? And so you can't eat those things. I mean, that definitely makes sense. If someone says you're actually not allowed to eat venison, well, why is that? Well, because it's immoral. Well, that's not really something that God tells me I can't eat. So, that's, and I'm not really sure exactly what the demonic message is here. I'm sure there's lots of things. I'm sure there's I think of the Ebionites, who Epiphanius writes about, how they actually changed some of the texts in the manuscript. When it says that John ate locust and honey, the Ebionites were really vegetarians, and they thought it was a moral issue to eat meat now after the sacrifice of Yeshua. And so they didn't want to eat meat because it would, they didn't want to sacrifice anything. There's no more sacrifices, no more dead animals after Yeshua. And so it was a moral issue for them to eat meats. And so what they did was they were so convinced of this, they actually had their own scriptures mangled. This is Epiphanius' what he accounts. And where it says John ate locusts and honey, they changed that Greek word just ever so slightly from locusts to cakes and honey. And so they made it look like John the Baptist was actually not a meat eater himself. And so what they were trying to tell people was that, well, all the godly people didn't eat meat, especially in Yeshua's day. And then you have him saying that when Yeshua said, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you, when he says this to his disciples, they changed that to, have I desired to eat this Passover with you? To a question instead of a statement. So Yeshua didn't know if he wanted to eat this Passover meal with the apostles. And so this is kind of what I think of is like I hate and abhor lying, but I love your law, is what David said. And so anything that goes against the commandments is a lie, right? If he says it's okay for you to eat, he tells the children of Israel, when you enter the land, you can eat as much meat as you want. And he says that these animals are permissible for you to eat. And then someone comes along and says, no, you're not actually allowed to eat that. It's immoral for you to eat that. Maybe that's what Paul is conveying here, because the Ebionites came later on, right? Maybe he's saying, don't listen to the spirit that tells you you're not free to eat what God says, and saying it's a spiritual moral issue, right? So that's just one thing that comes to my mind. I'm sure, today you have people who are of the persuasion that, killing any animal is wrong, for a lot of reasons, PETA, all those things. There's plenty of people that you could put that Paul is trying to convey to us here that the Spirit's telling us.
Absolutely. As somebody who's vegetarian myself, and have been so for well over a decade, except for the odd, don't get me wrong, like I'll eat meat probably once a year because I'm not averse to it. It's just I feel better when I'm running vegetarian. But if I had to eat meat, I'd eat meat, right? Obviously clean meat. But it's been interesting because what I've seen, and many can relate to this, is that there are many vegetarians or vegans out there where it's more of a religious approach that they're taking to the whole of it. And it doesn't mean that they're eating any healthier. In fact, many times they're eating all sorts of synthetic garbage, right? And their health is just, it reflects that. But they're coming at it from a religious perspective, not hey, this is what my body seems to thrive better off of perspective. So it's not about health. It's about a moral appeal, if you will. And that would apply, this scripture right here would apply to that exact mindset, where now it comes with a level of vehemence in saying you need to do this. It's morally wrong to not be doing what we're not doing, right? You shouldn't be eating animals. Look at these factory farms and how the animals are being treated. Well, I live out in farm country. I've seen some of the documentaries that are produced, and it's laughable. I'm like, maybe that's the condition in certain aspects, but that's not the norm. That's not where we grow up. We don't see that type of stuff around here. We see cows roaming, through beautiful, along the foothills of the mountains, in trees and stuff, just grazing and living in pristine area. And that's what's going to be butchered and find its way onto locals' tables, right? So it's not what they portrayed it to be, but that resonates in relation to that particular type of scenario that has run rampant for the past decade at least.
Absolutely. And then you see, for every creature of God is good and nothing is to be refused if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by the word of God and prayer. And so, what food, what animal do you suppose is sanctified, set apart by the word of God? I can't think of anything else besides Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, of course. So, it's just like, I believe it's in Genesis 9:6, where he says that, you can eat of everything that creeps and all these things. Well, did you look at the context of what already had been said, that there was clean and unclean? He knew that. And so, yeah, in the context of this, of what he has approved of as animals that you can eat whatever you want. Don't let anybody tell you can't.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's just when you isolate certain verses, you get into trouble. If you isolate Genesis 9, I believe it's verse 6, and then you isolate this, right? For nothing is to be refused, then you can walk in that narrative for sure.
And I think there's something else that needs to be kind of laid down here, because anytime that there is a Torah debate to be had, almost without fail, the first set of scriptures that will be quoted will be Paul. And it'll be the twisting of Paul's words. And obviously we see Peter warning about that in 2 Peter 3:16. But there's a question that needs to be begged. If Paul is being used as the authority in relation to establishing new doctrine, from whence did he get that authority to establish new doctrine? Because we don't see him ever granted the authority to ever lay down the law, like legitimately. And we see that in Acts 15, when there is a debate about theology, about doctrine. We see that he goes before James and Peter and the senior apostles that were with Yeshua himself. And he doesn't lay down the law. He lays down merely the concern. And then it's deliberated upon, and a deliberation is given to Paul for Paul to then go and act on. We never see at any given time that Paul is an authority in establishing doctrine. It's just not there. And so if people are to begin to use Paul's words out of context, without proper context, in this case, without the context of what the Hebrews would have had, because Paul's not making it abundantly clear to everybody. He's making it's already largely clear to those that he's communicating it to. They're going to get it. They're going to fill in the blanks. Now here we are, almost 2,000 years out, and we're not understanding what the filling in of the blanks are because we don't understand Hebrew culture, right? So Paul, in this situation, this would be a determining of new doctrine, which if you were to look at it out of context, and he simply didn't have that authority to establish new doctrine, nor do we see the accusations coming out against him, because if he was declaring everything clean, one, we would see the accusations against Yeshua. And now, if this was the way that this would to be interpreted, back then when he wrote it, we would also see that accusation being laid against him and him being persecuted or lynched for doing this. He never was in relation to matters of food. Don't get me wrong, there was accusations laid against him, but not in relation to something that would have been so clear and concise as this, that he's reviling the law by teaching people to consume everything that is unclean, right?
Exactly.
They would use Ezekiel 22 against him, right? Not differentiating between the unclean and the clean.
Exactly. I mean, he would have been really mad, I feel like, if God, well, I mean, I don't have to, it doesn't matter what I feel. I can see here that God would be really mad if his servants were not making this distinction anymore. It just wouldn't happen. And so, we can go all day on this, but I want to look at some of the things that you brought to my attention about this topic. And it's not, this is really where it all comes down. This is where you get your fundamental views from, is from the scriptures, I hope. Now, the results are just something that's going to help you possibly come to this conclusion, the same conclusion, that eating the things that God said don't eat is not going to result in good things for you. And so, David, we're going to go through some of these articles, some of the facts that you had brought up. We're going to go through the data. And even from a scientific perspective, we're going to see what exactly happens in the body when you consume the things that God forbids you consume. And so we're going to start with this first article, David, and you can go ahead and...
Fantastic. And just to give, kind of a context to this, so being 21 years in the natural health field, and especially working with people with different brain conditions, whether that was, strokes, concussions, brain injuries, but also a host of mental health conditions and other central nervous system related issues. This is, though on the periphery, this is something that is kind of up my alley type of thing. And that's why I really resonate towards this and understanding it. And I generally try to rely on, scientific papers. Now, what's interesting about this is, and you're going to see this theme emerge, is that there is an element of suppression out there, or censorship of truthful science that would go against the major pharmaceutical industry. And we firsthand experienced that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Where us ourselves have been in the courts and whatnot with the attempt to shut us down back in early 2004, 2005, 2006. But anyways, so here's something that's interesting here, because when we talk about, like, I've been in many debates in relation to eating clean, and there is a particular debate that emerges surrounding parasites. And one of the defenses that comes up often is parasites are everywhere, right? Don't hone in on the unclean animals. They are everywhere. And if I've had people say, if you understood, that parasites were basically everywhere, you wouldn't be eating anything. Oh, really? That's interesting. Okay. Well, there's different types of parasites. And so the first thing I want to talk on just briefly in a very general sense is that pigs are very closely related physiologically to humans. And one of the things that we deal with on a regular basis is thyroid conditions. And one of the things that we're helping people come off on a regular basis as we get their nutritional levels up and the body functioning the way that it should without outside intervention from pharmaceutical medications, is one of the things that we're helping people come off of is desiccated thyroid, which is pig thyroid, right? And it's literally desiccated and encapsulated and consumed, and it helps people with thyroid issues. Why? Because it's that close to our thyroid. Their thyroid is that close to our thyroid. Well, the same thing goes across the board. Their bodies are so similar to ours that whatever parasites would thrive in them will thrive in us. Whereas there's certain parasites you're going to pick up off of, pick your lettuce out of your garden. You might end up with some parasites from that. There's a good chance those parasites are just going to flush right through you, because why? Wrong environment. They're not there to flourish within you. Their environment was incredibly different that they thrived in. Same thing even goes with beef. There are certain parasitical infections you can get from beef that are quite detrimental to your health, but it is very few and far between, and nothing in comparison to what we're going to touch on here. So the first thing is in relation to this article here, parasitic and brain infections from the Merck manual. I'll just read a few parts of it. Going right to the neuro cystic cirrhosis. Neurocystic cirrhosis.
That is not an easy word.
It's not. Neurocystic cirrhosis. Yeah, it's a bit of, especially with somebody that has a lisp, it's a little bit harder to read, but is caused by pork tapeworm. The technical name for that is Taenia solium. And so it's a specific tapeworm that really thrives and is most prevalent within pork. And that's why it gets the name pork tapeworm. There's beef tapeworm as well. It's a different species of Taenia tapeworm. But the particular one for pork tapeworm is the Taenia solium, which is almost exclusive to the pig. And it's a different beast altogether compared to, contracting a beef tapeworm. Different story altogether. So of all the worms that cause brain infections, the pork tapeworm causes by far the most cases of brain infections in the Western Hemisphere. Now imagine that. Brain infection, oftentimes when we think of infection, we think of, bacteria or some, viral infection, something like that. But this is an actual infection of tapeworms, of their larvae, going into your brain. And what it does is it creates cysts. And those cysts is what becomes known as the condition of neurocysticercosis, right? So after people eat contaminated or food contaminated with the tapeworm's eggs, secretions in the stomach cause the eggs to hatch into larvae. The larvae will then enter into the bloodstream in all areas of the body, and then even the brain. And then that's when you end up with these different cysts taking place there. So what's interesting about this, without going down too far on this was really just to identify that, one, the number one cause of parasitical brain infections in the Western Hemisphere is pork, plain and simple, right? Causes a condition called neurocysticercosis, which is literally cysts developing on the brain. Now, what this will cause is not a whole ton of symptoms initially until those cysts begin to degenerate and the larvae begins to release, but then dies off. It releases a tremendous amount of toxins, which will then result in a host of symptoms, including headaches, hydrocephalus, because it can actually block the pathways for cerebral spinal fluid, creating increased pressure in the brain. It will it can create seizures. It can even create meningitis due to the inflammation of the meninges from the release of these toxins. Okay, so this is pork tapeworm, number one cause of parasitic brain infections in the Western Hemisphere. And so one of the arguments that's going to come up is, well, that's incredibly rare, right? Like there's always a risk with any food. You might eat peanuts and have an allergic reaction, right? Like there's always going to be some kind of argument. So let's go into this. Let's find out how rare this actually is. So I want, first of all, take a look at that brain, right? Oh, it's rare, right? It's going to be rare. That's someone else's brain. That will never be my brain, not from eating pork, right? Do you remember, there's going to be people on here that remember from the late 80s, early 90s. I'm not sure. You may have actually, it may have even gone into the late 90s and early 2000s even, where there was a campaign that you would see, in your television advertising, where it would talk about your brain on drugs. And it would show some, decrepit picture of your brain. This is your brain on drugs. Well, why is there not a campaign about your brain on pork? That's the first question I have.
People don't really want to see this. That's true, though. You have the same issue amongst those who are pro-choice. When you go out there on the street with a sign of a baby who has been aborted via saline abortion, they don't want to see that, or dismembered. They don't want to see that because that interrupts this paradise world that they think that they live in. They don't want to know these things.
Exactly. Yeah. As one individual comments, willfully blind. Well, there's an interesting aspect to this as well, that due to this, there's also mental impairment. So sometimes we get to a point where we have so much cognitive decline that we're actually incapable of being able to reason appropriately, where now it goes beyond willful blindness, but also it goes into just complete incapability of being able to understand, right? So now this is an extreme case, but there are many cases where when they take a look at it using MRI technology, it'll look like basically just, a starry sky with the amount of small dots in the brain, just small little holes all over the place. And so Once again, hey, this isn't being shouted from the rooftops. This has to be very rare. Well, when we scroll down just a bit here, this is coming from the Discover magazine, by the way, which is a very scientific-based magazine, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But let's go just up a bit here. So to the second paragraph there, it talks about when they're doing the MRI scans, that it will show up as whitish blobs, and that the initial diagnosis oftentimes would actually be as tumors. If somebody didn't understand or specialize in neurocysticercosis, what they would anticipate is that, oh, those are just tumors. You've got tumors in the brain. When in reality, no, these are just pockets of parasitic larvae just sitting there, right? That are either going to die and release a lot of toxins, or are going to be released and they're going to go elsewhere or punch more holes in the brain, or end up going back into the bloodstream and eventually out somewhere else, living in your intestines, whatever. So going down, let's go down a little bit further. Yeah, right here. This is about discovering what the prevalence of this actually is, because it can be mistaken as tumors. It can be misdiagnosed as various other mental conditions or brain health conditions. So how many false diagnoses are taking place? We don't know, especially given the fact that in medicine, parasites are not really addressed that much. Not unless you went to a third world country and you come back with some kind of illness, are they even going to begin looking into parasites being the potential causation of the disease. So what's interesting here, and this is a specialist who's writing this, or that's being written about the specialist, is that we see an emphasis. He puts a heavy emphasis on minimally, even in developed nations. Figuring out just how many people have the illness is difficult because it's easy to mistake the effects of tapeworm for a variety of brain disorders. The clearest proof is the ghostly image of a cyst in a brain scan, along with the presence of antibodies against tapeworms. The closer scientists look at the epidemiology of the disease, the worse it becomes. Nash and other neurocysticercosis experts have been traveling through Latin America with CT scanners and blood tests to survey populations. In one study in Peru, researchers found 37% of people showed signs of having been infected at some point. Why? Because it's going to leave markers on the brain. It's not going away. Not unless you understand how the brain works and you're able to address it, which is not common knowledge either. And I'll get into that in a second. So if we go back, if we go right down, I think right down to the bottom, I think there's going to be a closing statement on this in relation to the fact that nobody's talking about this. So here we go. Yeah, so the last paragraph there. None of this is rocket science, which makes Nash and all the more frustrated that so little is being done. I see this as a disease that can be treated and prevented, he says, but there are precious few resources available for treatment and little recognition of the problem. All of this seems to be very feasible, but nobody wants to do anything about it. Okay. We're going to talk about a particular disease that is directly associated with parasites. And this disease alone will bring in, just in North America, about $350 million per year into the medical system and the pharmaceutical industry. And it's a more rare disease. But that alone, if these types of conditions were recognized and addressed, there would be a major, and I'm talking billions of dollars removed from the pharmaceutical industry worldwide, just by identifying that parasites are at the root of the disease, rather than not acknowledging them and deeming it to be an incurable disease that now you have a lifetime customer. This is marketing 101. You now understand the lifetime value of that customer. You can estimate how long they're going to live with that condition, and you know how much they're going to bring in on a yearly basis. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But before doing so, I want to speak with a little bit of a level of authority here in relation to what he's discussing there. And especially given this magazine article is the Discover magazine, a science-based magazine out of the Eastern States. And at the time that they published an article on what we were doing back in 2005, they did an 8-page article on what we were doing. It had a subscriber base of 8 million people. Now, how this is relevant to suppress science. Doing what we're doing, helping people with mental health conditions, we've literally helped probably about 100,000 people at this point in time come off of pharmaceutical medications, mainly psychiatric medications, over the past 2.5 decades. When the first study came out on one particular supplement of ours, being the Empower Plus, it's a very broad spectrum micronutrient supplement that's designed in such a way that it can deliver the nutrients to all areas of the body, including the brain. The first study came out showing it to be over 3 times more effective than antidepressants. It made national news in Canada. The very next day, Health Canada came in and shut down any further studies and tried to get my dad and his business partner to go away. That's when we ended up in the courts with them after a gun-drawn raid on our headquarters and everything. It was a full-out, just all guns, pointed towards us type of thing. Shut them down. They can't be here in the marketplace. And here we are now. Fast forward almost 20 years, and we're still here after going through a major battle with Health Canada. Well, that battle continued on, and what we recognized is that the pharmaceutical industry was largely the push behind it all. And what took place is that it's not well known. In fact, just by me saying this, most people will be like, what? I've never heard that. It was discovered back in the 90s that brain cell regeneration could take place, which is pretty interesting. And it was done so utilizing 22 vitamins and minerals. Well, the researcher with his team that discovered this initially found out about our product, and they did a follow-up study in 2004 on our supplements and what they would do in relation to brain cell regeneration. And so what took place is they ended up removing a large portion of the frontal lobes of various rats, or punching holes in the parietal lobes, impairing their cognitive functioning. And what they found is after 90 days, they'd never seen it to this degree, is that there wasn't just a regrowth of some of the brain material. There was a full regrowth of the brain material. So where the rats that had the frontal lobe largely removed, there was no evidence that anything had been done by the time that they were done the study. With the parietal lobes, all they could see was scar tissue, but the holes had fully filled in. And what was the most remarkable part of the study is that these rats, after 90 days of doing testing with their cognitive functioning, is that they had received a full recovery in their cognitive functioning, and they were actually outperforming the control rats that never had a brain injury in the first place. So they'd had a full recovery. So that's the only way that you're going to be able to start filling in. And our supplement isn't the only one to do it. My understanding is that lion's mane mushrooms will also help with brain cell regeneration and healing trauma to the brain, physical trauma. And so it's only when you understand what's going on that you can actually begin to correct the brain. Now, this is profound research that just took place. You think it'd be shouted from the rooftops, because the old theory is that when you have brain damage, the damage is done. There's nothing you can do about it. They just disproved that, showing that you can actually correct serious brain trauma by changing the environment and getting all the nutrients necessary to the brain. This study showed that. It was the most exciting research that these researchers had ever done. Well, the Discover magazine hears about it. They publish an 8-page article on what I just communicated here. And then all of a sudden, just like we had experienced 5 years before, guns drawn, the university comes under fire. And we all know who funds these universities, that it's the pharmaceutical industry with their medical programs and all that they're huge funders into the universities. All of a sudden, the university is coming under pressure. The researchers shut up, which is shocking because they were ecstatic about this research. It was the best research they'd ever got their names on. And the whole thing goes silent. So dating back for a long time, there has been a suppression of scientific evidence, scientific research that would ultimately benefit humanity, because there is a major industry surrounding sick people. Sick people make a lot of money for particular industries, mainly the medical industry and the pharmaceutical industry, which are tied directly at the hip. So that's one element that I want to cover. Is there's a reason that you haven't heard about this, that if you've never heard about the fact that there's research taking place about neurocysticercosis and what it's doing to the brain, and that it's easily treatable. and that it needs to be looked out for, but yet it's being misdiagnosed. Like, how many times are people getting a CT scan, which I don't recommend either because it is detrimental to the brain. But if there's something else going on detrimental to the brain, it's better to know about it so that you can correct it. It's going to be less invasive than having a CT scan on the brain or an MRI. And then having a blood test to see if there's antibodies for those particular parasites, you can identify that those parasites are there. And so it's not being tested. How many times do you know of an elderly patient who goes in with, major brain degeneration? Their cognition is declined, mental impairment. How often are they being tested for parasites in their blood testing and through different imagery taking place, right? Whether it be an MRI or a CT scan, right? It's just not happening. So that's the first element that I want to cover there. But there's something interesting here, because, we can write this off as, well, pork consumption, you get a disease from it. It's rare. You can get disease from any food, it's no big deal. Just, ignore it. Well, let's go to the next slide. Okay. Something interesting here. Multiple sclerosis. It's what happens is you have your nerve cells, which are, kind of interesting shape, the neurons and all that. They have an axon. It's like an axle that connects two different points, right? The what do you call them? The axon receptors, and then where all of the dendrites are, which is a bigger area which branches off and makes all these connections, and it's sending and receiving messages all the time. So that's what's taking place with your nerve cells. But on the axon, there is what's called the myelin sheath, and it's a protective barrier for the neuron fibers, right? Or the nerve fibers. What happens is in multiple sclerosis is that myelin sheath is being broken down for some reason, and damage is occurring to the nerve cell. And then what happens is scarring happens over time, which medically is sclerosis. So what's happening is you have multiple sources of scarring or multiple areas of scarring within the nervous system. And that's what multiple sclerosis is. And it obviously affects the whole central nervous system to a great degree, to the point that eventually, people will die from it, right? So what's interesting is that there was a study that took place because it had been identified in certain, or in multiple sclerosis patients that had died, that when the cerebral spinal fluid was extracted, it had been discovered that sometimes there was a presence they had discovered of parasites, but it was overlooked. It was deemed to be negligible. Nothing to see here. No, it has got nothing to do with multiple sclerosis. It's an autoimmune condition. We don't know why. This is what the medical community is saying. We don't know why the body is turning on itself with this autoimmune condition and attacking the nerves and destroying the oligodendrocytes, which are responsible for repairing the myelin sheath around these nerve cells. We don't know why it's turned on both those elements and is destroying them, and so that reparation can't be made. We don't know why, but the body's doing it. That's what they're saying. So they say parasites, no effect. Well, this study takes place where the cerebral spinal fluid that had been kept from 10 different multiple sclerosis patients was examined. And what was interesting is in all 10 of them, this particular type of parasite had been found in the cerebral spinal fluid. But it was a very small one. The largest one was 1,000 microns, which is about 1 millimeter, which is a tenth of a centimeter, which is about 1/24th of an inch, right? Something like that, right? So it's very small. That was the biggest, and all the other ones were smaller, right? So whereas oftentimes they'll find parasites that are 20,000 microns, which in essence is getting closer to an inch, right? So very, very much smaller. So easy to overlook. But when the cerebral spinal fluid was taken into consideration and examined here, in every single case, post-mortem, people that had died with MS, this particular type of parasite was found, and they don't even have it really classified. They don't know what kind it is. They have a general classification of it, but it seems it's what they call a genospecies, which appears to be kind of almost like a hybrid between two different types of parasites, right? Well, what's of interest is it's very closely related to the pork tapeworm, or Taenia solium. It's of the same genus, the Taenia aspect of it. And so it appears that it's actually related to that. Now, you'd be saying, well, you're drawing a bit of a conclusion here that can't bridge that gap. Let's go to the next slide here. All right. Let's go right up to the top here. Okay. No, up higher. Okay, so this comes from Healthline. It's written 4 hidden dangers of pork. Let's go down there a little bit to the first paragraph. Among foods that inspire a cult-like following, now many will resonate with this because I've been saying this for years, that pork is the most idolized meat in North America by far. In fact, I'd say that in the Western world that would apply. It has more of a religious aspect to it than it does anything else. You start to, this conversation that we're having right now, you bring that up with people and they get defensive very quickly, and it becomes religious very fast. And not religious in the sense of Bible, but that they are emotionally invested in it. And so just as this article says, a cult-like following. Pork often leads the pack, as evidenced by the 65% of Americans eager to name bacon the country's national food. Unfortunately, that popularity comes at a cost. Along with being the most commonly consumed meat in the world, pork may also be one of the most dangerous, carrying some important under-discussed, and I'm going to repeat that, under-discussed. Once again, this is a major money maker because it is incredibly unhealthy. You cannot anticipate any healthy outcome in the consumption of pork. If you get lucky, you dodged a bullet. You're playing Russian roulette with it all the time. If for some reason you have no negative impacts, but oftentimes it takes years for those impacts to fully come to fruition. Some of these tapeworms will live in you for up to 25 years. That's half a lifetime for people that have major parasitical infections, or more than half a lifetime, because there are a lot of people that die prematurely directly related to parasitical infections. So, carrying some important and under-discussed risks that any consumer should be aware of. Let's skip the hepatitis E. High prevalence of obtaining hepatitis E through the consumption of pork, which, it's a bit of a more rare type of hepatitis, but that's where you basically get hepatitis E. But let's go down to the multiple sclerosis. Okay, and my understanding is Andrew, you're sharing these articles that everybody can go through and read after, right?
Yeah, I'll put them in the description of the live stream. I haven't done it yet, but I'll go ahead and do that after we have finished here, and so you guys can all go through it and read it.
Incredibly important, because when you take a look, you can see the footnotes. Those will take you to different studies. I couldn't find the particular study that I was reading about. Well, not about. It was back in early July of last year. I was reading an article that actually talked about the prevalence of MS for those that eat pork versus those who don't. And it was big. I don't want to misquote it though. But basically you are far, far, far more likely to contract or develop, MS if you ate pork versus if you didn't eat pork, right? And in fact, one of the, in one of the studies, they identify that eating beef, it's negligible. Like they can't correlate eating beef to developing MS, but yet it's an incredibly strong correlation between eating pork and developing MS. So I'll just read some of this from the multiple sclerosis aspect here. So one of the most surprising risks associated with pork, one that's received remarkably little airtime, is multiple sclerosis, a devastating autoimmune condition involving the central nervous system. I'm going to repeat that. Remarkably little airtime. Once again, this is the disease that in North America will bring in about $350 million per year for treatment of people that have MS. Take that across the world, we're now into the tens of billions of dollars every year just for MS. And MS isn't that prevalent, right? There are other diseases that are being caused by pork that are more prevalent. And when we take a look at the totality of it, and if you were to take a look at every disease that people are being treated for that are directly related to pork, we'd be talking in the hundreds of billions of dollars across the world every year is what pork consumption is bringing into the medical system and pharmaceutical industry every year. That's huge. That's huge. But just with this one alone, we're looking at literally multiple sclerosis. We're looking at worldwide, we'd be in the tens of billions of dollars every year just from the treatment of multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis, a devastating autoimmune condition involving the central nervous system. Well, they can't describe how it's an autoimmune condition, but once again, parasites are showing up in the cerebral spinal fluid of every one of these individuals. The robust link between pork and MS has been known at least since the 1980s. Researchers analyzed the relationship between per capita pork consumption and MS across dozens of countries. While pork-averse nations like Israel and India were nearly spared from MS's degenerative grips, more liberal consumers such as West Germany and Denmark faced sky-high rates. So interesting. MS almost doesn't exist in Israel and India. Pork consumption almost doesn't exist in Israel and India, right? So, in fact, when all countries were considered, pork intake and MS showed a whopping correlation of 0.87. Now, how they determine that, just to give an idea as to how big that number is, 0.87, is they will basically do a X and Y axis on a scatter plot graph. And what they'll do is they'll look at the consumption of pork and they'll look at the prevalence of MS. And then they'll put all the scatter plots there as to this is how much pork consumption is happening, this is how much MS is happening. And they do that with all the countries around the world. And if it creates a pretty solid line where there's only 13% of the variations can't be accounted for, which is a small number in science, then you'd end up with a 0.87 value, which is significantly high. So 0.87, which is much higher and more significant than the relationship between MS and fat intake, because it was thought that fat intake was a major contributor of MS. MS and total meat intake, which is obviously including pork, is 0.61. And MS and beef consumption, no significant relationship, right? It's not scientifically valid to even try to put a number there because there just was nothing to correlate. For perspective, a similar study of diabetes and per capita sugar intake found a correlation just under 0.6. So the relationship between pork consumption and MS is higher, quite a bit higher, than the relationship between sugar intake and diabetes. That's pretty huge. Why isn't it being talked about? That's the question. When you take a look at this, and we can scroll down to the next topic here, but when we take a look at this, you've got an industry here that is thriving off misinformation surrounding pork consumption. One other thing here, liver cancer and cirrhosis. I'm not going to go into reading this, but when you look at the science, what you're going to find is that you're more likely to develop what's deemed as alcoholic cirrhosis of the liver. You're more likely to develop that from consuming pork than you are alcohol. Like quite a bit more. Like it's
like
shocking.
You said, how many times has a person gone to the doctors and just, told that this is a result of your alcohol intake when it was also a result of their pork intake?
Well, that's exactly it. Because in the studies, what they found is that when you consume pork and alcohol, it compounds the effect and will create that cirrhosis of the liver, whereas alcohol consumption on its own, far less chance of developing cirrhosis of the liver. You combine it with the pork, you've got a done deal. The other thing is you combine sugar intake with pork and it will have, in essence, the same effect. It's a perfect recipe for creating cirrhosis of the liver. But pork is the common factor there, or the common causal factor above and beyond even alcohol consumption. And I'm not saying alcohol consumption won't create that effect. It's just that pork will create that effect far more effectively. So how many people are struggling or dealing with cirrhosis of the liver, and pork is actually the main culprit, not the alcohol, right? So once again, when we take a look at this, I'm actually done with that. As long as you're sharing these, as long as people have access to them, they can go and read the studies for themselves. And there's a host of studies there that are footnoted. Phenomenal information, highly suppressed information. And the reason being is that there is an industry that thrives off of the false concept of Jesus made all foods clean, including pork, shellfish, all of this garbage, right? And I know we hyper-focused in on pork. We could begin down the rabbit path of, talking about these bottom feeders that are highly toxic with heavy metals and stuff in the ocean, and that we're consuming them as delicacies. and that they are not healthy at all. And so we could begin talking about all of these unclean foods that we're not supposed to be eating. But pork becomes a very interesting topic because, one, it's consumed so much. It has that cult-like following or religious type idolatry to it. And it has a half-decent amount of science on it to show that Leviticus 11 did in fact have it right. And yet it's being ignored. So the question that needs to be begged when we take a look at it from a scientific approach is that if all food is clean, or anything that, I mean, obviously the definition of food, but all animals are clean to be eaten and consumed, right? If all of it's clean, why are we experiencing all the negative impacts from that? All the same negative impacts that they would have in the Old Testament. Because when that statement, if it was actually made, like I said, parentheses in the Mark 7, that it doesn't show up in the Aramaic transcripts and it doesn't show up in the earlier Greek manuscripts. But if that statement was actually made, wouldn't we anticipate that we would somehow be absolved from experiencing the negative impacts of consuming unclean animals?
That would only be the result that would make sense to my mind, that if he redeemed these animals, he would also redeem us from the consequences of consuming them.
Yeah, but yet we don't see that. In fact, I mean, in some of my debates, it comes down to like, oh, well, we pray over it, we accept it with thanksgiving, and it's made clean and whole and, it's sanctified. Oh, really? Okay, interesting. Then why am I dealing with people on a regular basis that are Christians, that are dealing with these types of issues, and I'm dealing with brain health issues and setting up protocols for them and supplying them with nutrients for their brain health issues that are largely a result of parasitical infections? In fact, this was really eye-opening for me because I didn't begin to learn about parasites to a great degree until 2017. And then I learned about MS over the past couple of years, that these studies have taken place to show that, hey, parasites are showing up without fail in their cerebral spinal fluid. And so as soon as I was able to make that bridge that gap, my eyes were opened a lot more, because we've dealt with a lot of people with MS over the years. A lot of people. We've dealt with all sorts of different nervous system issues. And in dealing with MS, I was left with a bit of a question, because we found that, giving them, especially, the Empower Plus, the littler bottle there, giving them those particular vitamins and minerals in a way that would get to their brain and facilitate healing, we found that people with MS would turn around to a great degree. We had people that were confined to wheelchairs, and all of a sudden they're not in the wheelchair anymore and they've gone back to work. We've seen that, which is, game changing. That's beautiful. But the issue that I had is that we never seemed to be able to fully correct it. And it finally clicked. What we were doing is we were correcting the damage from the parasites, but we weren't removing the parasites. The culprits were still there doing damage. We were just going in behind with nutrition and cleaning up the mess, but yet it was still taking place on an ongoing basis. We weren't addressing the root of the issue. It wasn't a nutrient deficiency disorder. It was a parasitical infection that could be corrected, the damage, through nutrient supplementation. But first, you'd have to deal with the parasites. If you didn't deal with the parasites, all you're doing is basically, following a bunch of, vandals through the city and replacing windows, hopefully at the same rate that they're breaking them. Right? You got to get rid of the vandals.
And that just makes me think of getting rid of this idea that Yeshua frees us from the commandments of God, because God's cry for his people is that, that they'd have such a heart in them that they would always fear me and always keep all my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. Because, you talk about the vandals, it's the same scenario with those who refuse to hear the law of the Lord, and then they go and they teach their children the same idea, and they just pass it on through generations of generations, and they have to reap the results of just growing up with this idea that, I'm free to eat whatever I want, and then their children are left with these results. And if we would just take hold of what the scriptures say and see the commandments as what they are and walking in them as liberty instead of walking away, that is not liberty. That is bondage. It's absolute bondage.
Put it in this perspective. You eat pork, yet let's say you develop MS. What greater form of bondage is there than to be a prisoner in your own body and a prisoner to your mind? Because your mind, you're going to become mentally impaired. So you're literally a prisoner to your mind, not able to exercise cognition, right? To be able to conceptualize, to be able to even articulate well, and all that's going to begin to degrade over time. But also you're now a prisoner to your body and likely confined to a wheelchair. What greater bondage is there than that? In that sense, like you're literally a prisoner to a disease. And so that's exactly what, when we take a look at it, I just look at this at Leviticus 11. I looked at it for years. The first time I read it, the Bible, front to back was earlier 2000s. And then when I read Leviticus 11, even though I was already involved in what we were doing, I read it back then and I actually just said, wow, that must be like a bad translation or something. That just seems so superstitious. Right? Me and my ignorance thought it was superstitious. It wasn't until I reread it after I had begun eating clean, not because of Leviticus 11. I started eating clean because I was cognizant enough to know that when I ate clean, I felt way better. And that's what eventually led me to becoming a vegetarian. But the unclean meats were gone. They were gone pretty quick once I started to analyze how I felt after every meal. And so once I began living that way and then began to understand the benefits of it and began to understand the science behind it, then I went and I revisited Leviticus 11 and I'm just like, whoa, how ignorant of me to ever think that was superstition. That was my ignorance showing forth that because my incapability of understanding his word, that I wrote it off as superstition, right? So it's just a beautiful thing when you take a look at it. These are his loving instructions for us to keep us out of bondage, to keep us free. We have to exercise some level of restraint. In fact, when we take a look at this again, he says, if you continue in my words, then you're my disciples indeed. What does it mean to be a disciple? To be disciplined in a particular area of teaching, right? To discipline yourself. It requires self-restraint. So you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Absolutely. That's what his mission is for us, is to liberate us from the curses that take place when we step outside of his instructions. He's trying to prevent it. He's trying to save us. It's the guardrail, right? For us to be able to enjoy the view without falling down the side of the mountain, right? That's what he's providing for us. And yet we're neglecting it with wanton disregard and saying, I'm free to do this. Yeah, but you're also free to receive those plagues that come with that. And you're going to.
Exactly.
You cannot exonerate yourself from the natural consequences that come from disobeying his word. And when it comes to dietary laws, if you like being unhealthy, if it's really worth, satiating the palate that you've developed, right? Because bacon doesn't taste good. It only tastes good because you thought it tasted good, right? Cannibals will tell you that humans taste good, but I'm sure humans don't taste good, although they taste quite similar to pork. That's something that needs to be brought up. When cannibals try to communicate what humans taste like, what do they allot it to? Pork, right? Why? Because we're so close. So it doesn't taste good. You only think it tastes good. And if you are more concerned about satiating that palate than you are about your health, then continue doing that, but you're going to suffer the consequences for doing so.
Yeah, I mean, pork can't just taste good to somebody who's never had it before, having it for the first time. I mean, you just acquire a taste. That'd be my best guess, because anybody who you do studies, they say that it's very similar to human meat. The people who eat human meat, they say it's very close, pork meat and human meat. And so as a disciple, David, say somebody has, we all come from this, right? We all are learning. That's what a disciple is. They learn. But we have eaten these things. We can't say like Peter, who says, "No, Lord, I've never eaten anything common or unclean." How would you help somebody, say this person, we all probably have still lasting results from what we used to eat. I mean, so someone had said, what do I do? How do I get rid of these parasites? Can I get rid of these? And then you have this Donna Porter asking this question. Do you have any answers that you could help these people out with?
Okay, yeah. Wasn't expecting to go here, but one I'd recommend rather than me just, I'm not going to be able to say everything, but in relation to the protocols surrounding parasite cleanses, I've done numerous, including turpentine, which many people will be like, what? Yeah, well, it's essential oil of the pine tree. It's not that bad. It used to be used as medicine back in the 1800s. But you just have to be careful with it. Don't overdo it. Otherwise you will go toxic, and you'll know when you go toxic on it. But I've done all the way up to that point, turpentine at points. I've done other things. I've tried the ivermectin, of interest with the ivermectin. Every time I took it, twice, I didn't feel right in the head. And so it left me, I parked it because I'm like, I don't know enough about it, but I had a bit of a suspicion that the reason why I wasn't feeling right in the head is that I was doing something to parasites in the brain, right? And I understand die-off and what that can do, dealing with gut health issues for many years, using things like the olive leaf extract here to kill off opportunistic pathogens in the gut. And I know that will create flu-like symptoms. And it creates inflammation, all that. So I had a suspicion that that's what the ivermectin was doing. And it wasn't until I actually dug in deeper with this particular research that if you have neurocystic cirrhosis, if you have that and you treat it too fast, things can go bad really fast. In fact, that's when the meningitis can develop and all that, because you are creating so much inflammation from the die-off of these parasites. You're actually accelerating the disease itself, perhaps, or like the symptoms of what you would expect to ever see from that condition, other than the fact that your brain is degrading. You're removing them too fast. And so I've done all sorts of different parasite cleanses. Go and do some research on it. Right now I'm on a parasite cleanse. We do it as a family for the last few months. 5 days before full moon to 5 days after the full moon. That's when parasites become active. And that's likely why you end up with people considered lunatics, right? Around the full moon cycle, is that's when parasites become very active and start to wreak havoc in the body. So go do some research. There's all sorts of different avenues. There's different things that can be taken to get rid of parasites. But I would recommend doing it even if you've been eating clean for quite some time. And in relation to Donna's question here, I haven't eaten pork since 2008. Do you think parasites could have been hanging out since then? Absolutely. Up to 25 years in the body is what they've discovered thus far. And those things are laying eggs. And the eggs are supposed to be excreted out through your fecal matter to then go infect a different host. But if they lose their way, that's when they get into the bloodstream. That's when they go into all sorts of organs. That's when they go into the brain, right? And that's why it's not everybody who eats pork will end up with MS or end up with neurocystic cirrhosis, because it's only when you have the larvae going where, and the eggs going where they weren't really supposed to go, because they have a particular pathway that they're trying to work with. It's a symbiotic relationship between humans and pigs. The pigs will have it in their muscles. We ingest it. It goes into our intestines. It grows into an adult, to a large tapeworm that sits there and excretes eggs, up to about 50,000 eggs. Over time, that comes out, goes back into the area, the environment, contaminates it. It's supposed to get back into the pig again to then go into its meat, where it stays in a smaller form. Then we eat the meat, and then it goes into our intestines, grows adult form. So cut the cycle off. But once it's in you, like I said, up to 25 years. So do a parasite cleanse. And in relation to trigeminal neuralgia, which once again is thought to be demyelination of the myelin sheath, and I sympathize for you. I've worked with a number of people with trigeminal neuralgia. It feels like a spark plug is being attached to your face as it fires. Oftentimes, for those that don't know what trigeminal neuralgia is, phenomenally painful nerve pain right through here. And pain meds generally won't touch it, and oftentimes it'll actually lead to suicide because of how excruciating it is and diminishing it is in the quality of life. So in relation to trigeminal neuralgia, yes, we've had great success with it, but I don't know what the causation of it is. We do seem to understand that it is a demyelination that's taken place. And so we've had great success with the Empower Plus. I would recommend getting on it, and I'd actually recommend going up to like 15 per day, which is a high amount. But that's what we used to do small studies on, like personal studies with our own clientele that were coming to us with trigeminal neuralgia. And generally within a couple of weeks, it was like a light switch flipped off, literally. No longer those electrical shocks going through the face. So that's what I would do, is I'd get onto that, but I would also treat it as if it was a parasite infection, because it probably is.
Okay. I hope that helps. Thank you, David.
That was a mouthful of information.
Yeah, that was great, man. You're giving a lot of information. I'm sure the people are really it's really helpful for them. So, there's some stuff, Jacob. We're almost done with the show here, brother, but we're going to touch on these things in some later videos on my channel. And just for a quick answer, brother, if you're allowed to disregard the law of Moses, as you said it here earlier, as a Gentile, then that means the law of Moses includes you shall not steal, you shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery. That is part of the law of Moses. So you're not free from that, brother. And so whatever information you're getting, whatever pastor has told you that, I'd look more into it, especially if you're reading from Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council, where apparently Gentile believers are not to obey the law of Moses in any way, shape, or form. That's not what the context was of that whole chapter. Go back and read the very beginning, where these men of the circumcision party, who were their own group, who said that you can't be part of the people of God without going through our ritual conversion of circumcision. It was their own thing. And they were telling new Gentile believers who had no concept of very many of the laws of God, i.e. laws of Moses. And so they were making it a prerequisite for them to become a people of God. And the apostles were getting mad, specifically Paul and Peter, because they're like, no, the Holy Spirit is falling upon these men just exactly as he did on us. The Holy Spirit fell on us. And so it's not like you had to be circumcised before the Spirit fell on you. It's not like Abraham had to be circumcised before he was a people of God. And so this was a prerequisite. It was how the law is to be observed. Paul says that the law is good if someone uses it lawfully. And so using it in a way to be obeyed as a prerequisite to becoming part of God's people is not a good.
Hey, Andrew, I think your mic died. I can't hear you. I don't know if you can hear me, but I can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, for some reason I don't hear you, David. Okay, anyways, if you can hear me, it was meant to... Hey, guys, give me a 1 in the chat if you can still hear me. I'm about to close out here, but I want to finish up this answer. Give me a 1 in the chat if you can hear me. Okay, cool. Okay, so this was let's just go there real quick. We're going to close up here, guys, but this is the last thing that we're going to address tonight, because I don't want anybody thinking they left here with a question unanswered, but... Okay. So let's just read through this real quick. And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. There's what they believe. Okay. So going down. Now the apostles and elders came together to consider this matter. And when there had been much dispute, Peter rose up, men and brethren, you know that a good while ago God chose us, that by mouth that the Gentiles should hear the word and the gospel and believe. So God, who knows the heart, acknowledged them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us, and made no distinction between us and them purifying their hearts. Just like in Acts 10, this is what Peter's learning, right? He just learned this. Now, therefore, why do you test God by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? Now, is he saying that, hey, we can't bear obeying God's commandments? When Jesus said that his laws are not burdensome, or and John says that obey his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome, and Psalm 119:45 says that his laws are liberty, not a burden. What is the burden? It's the yoke of these Pharisees, these Pharisees believers, these circumcisions, laying on them this requirement to get circumcised before they're even considered a part of God, a part of God's people. And so there was all these things. They had to know all the things that the Jews knew about the Torah in order to be acceptable. And so that would have taken for a long time, right? And he knows that. He's not discounting the law of God. He's discounting their application of it. So that's why he says, men and brethren, listen to me. Simon has declared how God at first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And so they're still not understanding, like, they don't have to understand everything in order to be a part of God's people. And after this, he's all the prophecies. Known to God from eternity are his works. Therefore, I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. By the way, all things from the law of Moses. I hope you understand that. These are all things from the law of Moses. And so these are things that they started them out by saying, let's not trouble them by putting on them the burden of having to understand all things about the law of God. Let's start them off with a couple things, that they be sanctified from their pagan communities. They'd be set apart. They'd start to be lights. They start to walk in the light of Christ. And let's start them off with these things. And by the way, if you say, dietary instructions, that's not for Gentiles. Well, I don't know what you think abstaining from blood means, but that is something you can't consume. These Gentiles were commanded, you can't eat blood.
As well as things strangled.
And so
two elements right there, dietary.
That's one of the things you can't eat. And so there goes this idea that dietary instructions don't apply to the Gentile believers. But this is a really crucial part. For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath. His point for saying this, which nobody likes to bring up in their sermons, is that their expectation for these believers, these Gentiles coming in and wanting to be believers in Christ and learn his ways, the expectation was they'd be in the synagogues on the Sabbath with these other Jewish believers as one people, and they would continue to learn God's instructions. They would hear Moses, they would hear the law of Moses and learn and apply it to themselves as life goes on. That's called sanctification, brother. So I would encourage you to do the same, is to look into the commandments and see how can I apply this to my life. And so, hey guys, I hope that was helpful. David, I appreciate you coming on. This was a pretty long one, but it was very helpful. I'm not exactly sure why your mic turned off. Maybe we've said so many words on here that they're wanting to shadow ban. It's very possible. But I appreciate you coming on, and I wish I could hear you, brother. I don't know what happened. I saw a little thing up here that says your microphones are all off now and blah, blah, blah. So we'll talk to you soon, brother. Thank you for coming on, and I appreciate you. All right, guys. I hope that was helpful for you in any way. And, I'm going to try to do more live streams. I don't know how much, because I want to be able to get more concise videos out there on my channel so that I can point people to them. In this case, I don't have a specific video addressing the Jerusalem Council, which is why I felt the need to have to address it. But I want to have a concise explanation that I can point people to go see and check out these short videos where you can get a short, simple answer, concise answer. And so that's what I'm spending my time on, is getting videos out like that. But if we can do more live streams in the future, then if Yah wills, then we're going to do that. So I appreciate all of you who showed up and stayed throughout the entire time. This was a long one, but it was a good one, filled with a bunch of information. So, let your friends and family know, share it with them. And hopefully that, you got some beneficial information yourself. So thank you, Eternal Light. You're a blessing. Always good to see you in the chat and in the comments of the videos. You're an absolute blessing, as are all of you. So blessings to you all. And I hope to see you in the next live chat and also in the comments in the future of future videos. So blessings to you all.